Moment while that loads up. And while it loads up, we can now do screen share. There we go. And then we go back to YouTube and wait for it to finish. Finish. And finish. Don't you love when that little waiting bar is going along and then it stops? Oh, there we go. And let's double check that that all looks correct. It does. All right. I believe that with a minimum amount of fuss, we are good to go. And at only 12:01. How impressive that the technology let us get it done this fast. All right. So good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for coming together so that we can study another section of Torah. We are picking up here in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, and we are in Parashat Re'eh. And like all of this section of Deuteronomy, there are so many things that are going on. So much of what Moses is saying is, as we talked about last week, a recap. Sometimes there are additional reinforcements of previous commandments, but often with new nuances or elements, and sometimes things that were not recorded earlier in the Torah, but are clearly being repeated for the benefit of the nation at this time. All of this is taking place, which means there's an infinite amount that we could possibly be talking of. And I always feel guilty having to pick something, but we're going to go ahead and start off with chapter 14 with the topic that I hope you'll find is not only interesting halakhically, that is to say, in the case of Jewish law and practice, but is also very interesting in terms of our personal, spiritual, psychological, and communal behavior. I know many people have a false dichotomy in their mind that there is law and there is spirit, and that the two of them are very different, and you can either care about law or you can care about being a spiritual person. That is not a dichotomy that Judaism recognizes. Fundamentally, when we believe the Torah is given as instructions, meaning the commandments to live by, we believe that God actually wanted us to take it seriously, to study it, and that through our investigation of living Jewishly, we are going to come closer to God and improve our own spirit and self and life and everything else. I'll be talking a little bit more about that tonight with my little commercial in here for those that are watching it live, because we'll be talking tonight in the Anyone Can Pray series about the Torah service during the Shabbat morning service in particular, although much of it applies for any other Torah service as well. And the Torah service is a prayer service through study. This is more of a study that informs our spirit without the formal structure of that service, but much of the lesson is going to be the same. So let's go ahead and dive in on what many may think as an uninteresting or unimportant aspect of Jewish law. Certainly it is an element of Jewish law that many people are either unaware of or do not bother themselves to observe, and see what's going on here and why we might want to pay more attention. All right, chapter 14, verse 1. Children are you to Adonai your God. You are not to gash yourselves. You are not to put a bald spot between your eyes for a dead person. For you are a people, holy to Adonai your God. It is you whom Adonai has chosen to be for him a specially treasured people from all the peoples that are on the face of the ground. Okay, so first of all, I have to point out that I didn't pause between verses 1 and 2 because the basic structure of the commandment is not stopping between 1 and 2. Yes, verses are their own unique kind of grammatical structure, but sometimes we have to remember that we cannot understand one verse in isolation without looking at the very minimum of its exact context, but of course, more broadly as well. So let's make sure we understand what it seems to be saying. Peshat, on the surface level, the basic understanding that we might get from this verse, just reading through it very superficially. Well, it seems to be saying that there is a practice, perhaps among other peoples, that is familiar to the Israelites, that when someone dies, that you gash yourself, that you maim yourself in some way. You ritually scar yourself as a sign of your grief. In Judaism, we have the practice of tearing our clothing, but apparently in some other cultures, it was not uncommon, or at least not unheard of for this generation, for people to hurt themselves. And this form of self-harm is being prohibited by Judaism. That for the dead, we are not allowed to engage in this practice. Additionally, we are being told that we are not allowed to put a bald spot between our eyes. Now, that's a rather strange phrase. And again, one that maybe we're not familiar with, but you've probably heard the expression of somebody tearing their hair out. It is something that is done in some cultures, and certainly was done more frequently in antiquity, that a person might literally rip out part of their hair as a sign of their grief. And the Torah is coming to prohibit both of those practices, that we are not allowed to take and harm ourselves. We're not allowed to remove the hair on our head as a sign of our grief. So with that superficial understanding, we then turn to the superficial explanation of why we're not allowed to do those things. Obviously, we are always mindful that when God tells us don't do something, that it is a command, but we should pay special attention when a commandment comes with an explanation, with a reason, with some additional motivational statement right after it. And that's what we get. Why are we not doing this gashing and this balding of ourselves? Well, you are a people that is holy. You are an Am Kadosh. You have a special relationship with God. And wait a minute, why does that make this not allowed? Again, this is what the transition between superficial and beginning to get a little bit more into Torah study deeply. It seems like this is going to be a explanatory statement, a motivational statement, this is why you need to be following along. And all it's telling us is something that we've been told 1,000 times before, pardon the hyperbole, that we are an Am Kadosh, that we are a holy people, and that we have this special relationship with God, being an Am Segula, being this treasured people, and that we have a special role that is distinct from the role of everyone else on the face of the earth, or ground, as Fox more precisely translates the word Adamah. That doesn't tell me exactly why I shouldn't be gouging or gashing or doing other of these behaviors. It seems kind of a non sequitur, disjointed. And that means that we have to dig deeper. And that is one of the most beautiful parts about Torah, is it gives us everything we need to know, but it doesn't spoon feed us. Instead, it lays out the words and says, now think about it and work on it. But it doesn't expect us to do that on its own. It expects us to do that with the help of the oral tradition, with the help of Midrash, with the help of our commentaries, and with the help of our study like this, the give and take of a discussion. So we're going to dive into just these two verses as our focus today, because this concept is a little bit more broad than you might at first understand. Yes, it does say you shouldn't gash yourself and that you shouldn't make this bald spot for the dead. Well, this is actually talking about more than just that. It is talking about tattooing. It is also talking about how we mourn in general. And one of the places where we see the discussion of mourning is in an area that may not be familiar to everyone, but is in the space between Pesach and Shavuot. As we'll see from this quote here taken from Shulchan Aruch, the great law code that was made in the 1500s, during that period between Pesach and Shavuot, during the counting of the Omer, what's known as Sfirat HaOmer, and specifically until Lag BaOmer, which is the 33rd day of the Omer, there are many customary practices of semi-mournfulness. And we're going to go ahead and look at some of those. And I promise we're coming back to our cutting and our hairing and all of that. But let's go ahead and see what the general theme is here, and it'll come back. It is customary not to get married between Pesach and Shavuot until Lag, meaning the 33rd day, because during that time, the students of Rabbi Akiva died. So there is a tradition, a teaching, that during the time of Rabbi Akiva, who lived at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome, that there was a mass catastrophe affecting his students, and that it stretched between Pesach and Lag BaOmer for those 33 days. And so in commemoration of that, we diminish our joy. And one of our chief joys, often held up as the chief joy in Judaism, is, of course, getting married. And since marriages are the kind of thing that you can schedule, as opposed to other things that come upon us without prediction, don't schedule it during the time when we are in a mournful state. The Ramah, who is the Ashkenazic additional voice that comes to complete the Shulchan Aruch in all of its current printings, adds, however, from Lag BaOmer onwards, all this is permitted. So he's clarifying that this prohibition on marriages only extends till Lag BaOmer, and then for the rest of the counting of the Omer, all the way up until Shavuot, which happens on the 50th day, that window of time does become open for other celebrations. Now, it is customary, says Joseph Caro, the original author, not to cut one's hair until Lag BaOmer, since it is said that that is when they stopped dying. Now, the cutting of hair is the opposite of a mourning practice in Judaism by this time. Like we saw in Deuteronomy, cutting of the hair or even yanking the hair out or shaving the hair off one's head was a sign of grief for many other cultures. We have the opposite sign of grief, in no small part because we were not touching our hair during that original period when other people removed hair as a sign of grief. There are sort of two different ideas when it comes to grieving and how to show one's grief. One of them is that I will allow the emotions to overcome me to such a point that I will essentially harm myself, gash myself, pull my hair out. I will show my grief by physical demonstrations of my pain and my suffering. I will, in some ways, increase my suffering to show the level of my grief. Judaism, on the other hand, doesn't do that. Instead, we let our hair grow uncut, and obviously not cutting ourselves in any other way. We allow ourselves to stop focusing on extraneous activities. So we're not going to social engagements, we're not beautifying ourselves or all of those sorts of things, but we don't add to our suffering. We merely stop running from it. And that is a very important distinction, as we'll see when we get further on. So this notion then is exemplified that while we are grieving for the nation, during that 33 period, we will treat it as though we were grieving for our relative, where also for Shloshim, the 30 days right after a relative passes, we neither shave nor cut our hair. Onward. One should not cut one's hair until the 34th day, the day after Lag BaOmer, in the morning, unless the 33rd day falls on Friday, in which case one may cut one's hair then in honor of Shabbat. The Ramah, the Ashkenazic voice, adds, but in these countries, meaning in Europe, we do not follow the custom he advocates. Rather, we cut our hair on the 33rd day, Lag BaOmer itself. And we rejoice a bit. We actually make Lag BaOmer a bit of a celebration. It's not merely that's the last day, that's the first day of celebration. And we do not say Tachanun. Tachanun is a prayer segment that comes immediately after the Amidah on weekdays, which is why if you've only prayed on Shabbat, you've not seen this portion. And it is a penitential and self-reflective moment. It's characterized by falling on one's face. We don't do that exactly like you might imagine. Usually you'll see people putting their head down on their arm, but I make a mistake. It would be on my right arm because this is the arm for tefillin, and we don't put our head down there. So we have our head down, and we are penitent, but not on Lag BaOmer. On Lag BaOmer, in the Ashkenazic world, it is too joyous a day for that level of penance, and therefore that section of the service is omitted. And someone who is performing a Brit Milah or circumcising his son is allowed to cut his hair during the Sfirah, meaning during any point of those first 33 days, in honor of the circumcision. So it's a great example of how there is a difference of opinion between the Sephardic world, which is what is represented by Joseph Caro, and the Ashkenazic world, which is represented by the Ramah and the italics in this text. And it's also a very good example that although this is a very strongly adhered to custom, it is not one that overrides many other principles in Judaism. For example, a Brit Milah has to be done on the eighth day after the birth, unless the health of the child is in question. And that's not the kind of thing we can schedule to avoid the Sfirah, the time between Pesach and Lag BaOmer, because the baby's going to come when the baby wants to come. So the baby comes out and you might be thinking, but this is a time of mourning. No, the actual mitzvah and celebration of the Brit Milah supersedes the customary mourning period, and thus we are obligated to go ahead and make ourselves look better and to rejoice in the birth of that child. So it's a wonderful example of that back and forth tension. There's another tension as well. Let's scroll down to the next paragraph. We'll get that all on the page. Some have the custom to cut their hair on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, but this is a mistake. Now, Rosh Chodesh Iyar is the month right after the month of Pesach, and that means that about 2 weeks into the Omer, we change from Nisan to Iyar. On Rosh Chodesh, the day where we mark that transition, which is a semi-joyful holiday-ish day, you might think, well, I can cut my hair. In Sfarad, in the Sephardic world, no, they say do not cut your hair on that day. The Ramah, the Ashkenazic world, however, in many places, the custom is to cut the hair until Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and they do not cut their hair from Lag BaOmer forward, even though it is permitted to cut one's hair on Lag BaOmer himself. But those places who have the custom to cut their hair from Lag BaOmer onwards do not cut at all after Pesach until Lag BaOmer. All right, so we'll come back to the rest of this because we're going somewhere very important, but I want you to understand the differences. Ramah brings two different customs. See, there's actually, there are many places where people will keep cutting their hair after Passover all the way up until Rosh Chodesh Iyar for about 2 weeks. And that's okay. Why? Because Nisan, the month of Passover, is considered to be in its totality a month of celebration and rejoicing. Passover is kind of a big deal. So we can't take away from our joy too much. And by not cutting our hair, we are in a sign of mourning, and therefore we should allow ourselves to cut our hair at least while we're still in the month of Nisan. And then once Iyar begins, then we follow the rest of the custom from the beginning of Iyar all the way up until Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the counting. So that's one customary set of practices. But there's the other version, which do not cut the hair from Pesach until Lag BaOmer, and in fact, they will then, cut their hair from Lag BaOmer onward, like we sort of talked about before. So he is bringing two different versions. So really, what we have here in the second paragraph are three different groups of practices. Don't cut it at all, and not even on Rosh Chodesh Iyar. You can cut it until Rosh Chodesh Iyar, until the beginning of that month, and you can't cut it between Pesach and Lag BaOmer, but afterwards is perfectly fine. Those are three different options that have been outlined, and those are not the only versions. Instead, what Ramah goes on to say, and within one city, meaning within your town, your community, it should not be that some follow one custom and some follow another, because lot titkodedu, do not cut yourselves, which is the beginning of our verse here in Deuteronomy, could also be interpreted, as it is in Yevamot 13b in the Talmud, as lo tesa'agu agodot agodot. And you're going to have to trust me on this, unless your Hebrew's very good, that written out without the voweling, it is very easy to see how you could interpret the word lo titkodedu as this other phrase, which would mean do not make groups and groups. Do not make separate groups. Do not touch yourself into separate little bubbles of practice. All the more so, one may not follow both leniencies. So obviously we should be consistent, and we should be consistent with our community. And all the more so, If we're having to figure it out for ourselves because we're outside the community or we're starting over somewhere new, we definitely do not follow both leniencies, which would involve cutting our hair up till ER and then resuming the cutting from Lag BaOmer onward. So there would be only a very small window in between where we weren't cutting. That would be trying to take two bites of the same apple. It's not considered appropriate. Everybody with me so far? I know that the prohibitions during this time of year are not widely known by many people. So just want to double check if everybody's still doing okay with it. Yeah, just hit our double check there. Okay, looks like we're good. Very nice. All right. Now, he finishes off Joseph Caro with a great line that I couldn't pass up, which is, women have the custom not to work from Pesach until Shavuot, from sunset onward. So, as we all know, we don't do work on Shabbat, but during the Sfirat HaOmer, during this time of the Omer, it was customary in his community for women to say, whoa, 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 it's sundown, and that means for these 7 weeks, I don't do any more work. I'm not cooking after sundown. I'm not doing the dishes after sundown. I'm not ironing your clothes or any of the other things that you might interpret as being what women might do. The principle here is that, nope, not doing that during this period between Pesach and Shavuot. Now, of course, he doesn't go into any extensive description of why that might be, but the Mishnah Brura does give us a commentary on it, which I think is quite insightful. The reason is that they, meaning the victims of Rabbi Akiva's students, were buried after sunset, and the people neglected their work. Right? If that was the time that they were allowed to be buried, then the people who were doing other work would have left their work behind and gone and done the burying, because you're not going to leave a body around. There are some that argue that, in fact, this is not talking about just a generic catastrophe that befell the students of Rabbi Akiva, but that this was specifically part of the reprisals of the Bar Kokhba revolt, and that it took this long before the Romans would allow us to bury our dead at all. And so the bodies were just laying in the field for this whole period of time, this month plus, and now they were finally allowed to bury. You're not going to delay that. You're going to rush out, even if it's sunset, and you'll neglect your work. So in honor of neglecting the work to bury the dead, the women wouldn't do work during this whole time period. Another reason, and again, Mishnah Brura is bringing multiple explanations because the community has multiple explanations, is in the Torah, one of the other great law codes that preceded Shulchan Aruch, is that since this is the time of the counting of Omer, and that counting is written about in the language of Shabbatot, meaning weeks, and remember that word Shabbat comes from the root word to cease or stop, it is appropriate to cease work. According to this reason, it is permitted to resume work after the count. That if it's not about stopping all work to bury the dead, but merely about honoring the Shabbatness of the counting of the Omer, which has the element of ceasing from work, then once you've actually counted the Omer, then you can go ahead and get back to work, because now you've done that duty and you are out of that Shabbati-ish time zone. All right, but back to our main discussion. Sometimes there are just tangents that are interesting to me that I don't want to pass up if I can avoid it. And you all got one of those today. So we turn now to Mishnah Torah, which was the earlier comprehensive law code written by Rambam. And we're going to look now not at the cutting, but at the question of the, not the cutting of the hair, but of the question of the cutting of the skin, which is tattooing. And Rambam explains, the tattooing which the Torah forbids involves making a cut in one's flesh and filling the slit with eye color, ink, or with any other permanent dye. And indeed, although tattooing today is a much more sophisticated art form with much better technology than a knife and ink, like in the old days, this is still fundamentally the way tattoos work. The skin is cut or pierced with needles, and then ink is injected so that it will be a permanent part of the scarring that takes place in the artistic form. This was the custom of the idolaters. who would make marks on their bodies for the sake of their idols, as if to say that they are like servants sold to the idol and designated for its service. And indeed, in Sefer HaMitzvot, one of Rambam's other books, he states that some sects in Egypt still follow these practices. It is not unusual even to this day for people to brand themselves according to either things that they are passionate about. Certainly some people still will put tattoos on themselves involving their religion or faith. Others will put tattoos upon themselves about their political ideology. And this is an act that one might have thought that Judaism would say, well, we're wearing special clothes, a talit that marks us as being God's servants, and we have special practices such as tefillin, which are very obvious to mark us as God's servants. Why not go the next step and do a branding? Other religions do it too. Why can't we? Well, pretty much because other religions do it too. That is to say, one of the fundamental things is that we saw in our second verse was that we are set apart and we're not going to follow the practices of these other faiths, that we have a special path that is unique for ourselves. We're going to come back to that when we get to Sefer HaChinuch in the second page. So Rambam continued and added, as a technical element of what tattooing means, if a person wrote and did not die, or died without writing by cutting into his flesh, he is not liable. So if you take a pen and you write something on your hand, or you take something that is like a brush, or most importantly in the modern world, something like henna, which is a very intense plant dye that is often used for body decoration, that's fine. That is not considered to be a form of tattooing, because there is no dyeing that is taking place here. There is no inking that is happening that is permanent in a way that was the actual prohibition that the Torah is talking about. And then one of the commentaries point out, the Minchat Chinuch explains that the prohibition against writing on one's flesh applies only when it is permanent. In this manner, he justifies the acts of people who jot down notes on their flesh when they have no paper available. So the vast majority of Jewish authorities say, if you need to write a shopping list on your hand, that's perfectly fine. You are not violating the Torah. If you have your shopping list tattooed on your hand, one, that's not very clever, and two, yes, that would be a prohibition of this element. But let's continue in the more involved discussion of why this is so, which is found in Sefer HaChinuch. Again, I highly recommend it. It's going to have some things that we disagree with, and certainly some of his phrasing is lamentable, but as one of the more accessible books, both by translation and content, for people to understand not just the broad outline of how to observe a commandment, but much of the discussion around its meaning, Sefer HaChinuch is a great starting place. Don't finish there. Like I said, there's much in it that is still going to be unsaid, and much that is said that I wish had been unsaid, as we'll see. So going to the mitzvah, to not gash yourselves like the worshippers of idolatry. To not gash our bodies like the worshippers of idolatry. That is what the mitzvah is. And about this it is stated in our verse in Deuteronomy, you shall not gash yourself. And this negative commandment is repeated with another word, as it is stated in Leviticus. Remember, I did point out that many commandments are showing up in Deuteronomy that were mentioned elsewhere, but the contrast is providing an important insight. And a marking for your soul you shall not put onto your flesh. And it is said that one who makes a mark for the dead is liable, whether it is with the hand or with a tool. But for idolatry, with a tool one is liable, with a hand one is exempt. Something that people often misunderstand is that when Torah prohibits something, it is often prohibiting a particular way of doing it as being the Torah level commandment. And the rabbis were very explicit until the modern world of trying to make sure that all Jews understood precisely what the Torah had prohibited, where the rabbis had put a buffer around it in order to maintain that Torah prohibition with a little cushion, sort of a second ring of security, the belt and suspenders methodology, if you will, and that we should understand those. And that's what's being explained here, that because of the unique way the wording is found between Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that one can deduce logically that when making marks for the dead, no matter which way you do it, it is considered to be prohibited. But for idolatry, one would need to use a tool for doing so, an actual knife of some form. Now, that doesn't mean that it's okay to do it without. It just means that as far as the Torah is asking, then that is where you would become liable for punishment. As such was their custom, idolaters, to gash themselves in front of the idol with a tool. And the like matter that is written, this is in 1 Kings 18, and they gashed themselves like their statue with swords and spears. So this is a sample of how people would gash themselves and their idolatrous actions, and they would do so with their tools, in this case, a sword or a spear. And regardless, according to that which appears to come out from the words of our rabbis, meaning the teachings of our sages, may their memory be blessed, and here in Makot 22, the liability of the negative commandment is only about one who gashes himself for the dead or for idolatry. But for one who gashes himself without a reason or from anger about his house that has fallen or his ship that has sunk, these would all have been considered tragedies, even though it is something extremely disgusting and ugly and forbidden, there was no liability of the negative commandment for it. So again, the Torah wants to, the rabbis want to make a distinction of what the Torah is actually prohibiting and what we also condemn. So we condemn the gashing of yourself for any reason whatsoever. It's just a disgusting, ugly, and forbidden thing in the words of Sefer HaChinuch. However, if you want to know who is violating the Torah prohibition and who is not, but still doing something that isn't great, you're only violating the Torah prohibition if you did it motivated by the dead or idolatry. For these other reasons, you have not broken the Torah commandment, you have merely violated rabbinic practice, which is its own problem. And as we'll talk about a little bit further on, and have already seen hinted at with this notion of communities trying to stick together, definitely needs to be avoided. Okay, how are we doing so far? Just double check our questions on YouTube. No one's popping up. Okay, so let's go ahead and see where we go with this. It is from the roots of the commandment that it is in order. This is the standard practice for Sefer HaChinuch. Once he has outlined the general do's and don'ts of a commandment, he will then try to explain its root, its ikar, the essence of that commandment, of what it's trying to accomplish and why. In order that we do not do amongst ourselves any matter at all that is similar to the worshippers of idolatry. So in general, Judaism has tried to distance us from the worshippers, from the ways of the worshippers of idolatry. Now, that's not entirely possible. They sing, we sing. They offered sacrifices, we offered sacrifices. They had communal services. We're going to have communal services. It's not possible to go 180 degrees away from their activities. But where possible, the Torah seems to be very adamant that we not imitate their practices in our worship, and in particular that we not adopt those practices that would not be obvious as being elements of our connection to God, such as singing, and something non-obvious like gashing oneself. But Sefer HaChinuch continues to explain that it's deeper than just trying to isolate ourselves from the practices of idolatry. It is not proper for the chosen people, this Am Segula, this treasured group, those of the wisdom of the precious Torah, to pain themselves about something from the creation of God, except for the matter through which he, blessed be he, commanded us to pain ourselves. Now, I apologize. I know the English translation can still be a little clunky, but just let's unpack this a bit. He is saying, look, if we are truly to be wise, if we are actually learning from the Torah, not just observing the Torah, but actually learning from the Torah of what God values in this world and how God wants us to live, then we should understand God does not want us to cause our own self-suffering from anything in God's creation. Yes, even the ship sinking and all of my property is gone and now I'm bankrupt, that doesn't mean that we should be moved to cause ourselves more suffering and pain than obviously the discomfort that we're going to feel and the problems our life will have because of this catastrophe. But the idea of woe is me, let me tear out hair, woe is me, I'm going to, cause myself wounds, that is the antithesis of what Torah should be teaching us. If we're actually truly loyal to Torah and have learned its wisdom, then we'll know that God doesn't want us to cause pain to ourselves because of something in God's creation. God's creation was not designed in order to instigate additional decisions to create pain in ourselves because of what's happened in the world around us. That's not the Torah way of looking at our own existence. Unfortunately, that is very common in the idolatrous world of the ancient world. And psychologically, it's still very common for many people today, even from among many people that are Jewish, to believe that somehow suffering should be increased at our own hands, that we should do without, or that we should get rid of things that bring us pleasure, because somehow that will ennoble us and raise us up closer to God. Judaism has a strong tendency against overindulgence, and certainly gluttony and debauchery are a big problem. But so too would be creating pain for ourselves for anything other than what God told us that we could be upset about. Like, for example, when we mourn our loved ones, that we are commanded to do, and we will continue with that discussion in just a second. So, but that we should destroy our bodies and disfigure ourselves like fools is not good for us. Right? That is not the way a people that are meant to represent the wisdom that God has given to the world should behave. And it is not the way of the sages and men of understanding, meaning that if you look to the wise leaders of the community, you won't see this. But, and here's the uncomfortable part of his classical education, but rather an act of the masses of lowly women that lack intellect, that have not understood anything from the creation of God and his wonders. Okay, obviously not a great phrase, and it's meant as an idiomatic expression. It possibly also did mean that he thought that this was the group that had the most propensity to this. There's much to be said sociologically about the fact that many of the mainstream teachers were looked askance at female practices, but many female practices were created precisely because they were barred from entry into the mainstream learning system. And that once that was overcome and more women were allowed to study in a more normalized way, that such things weren't going on. And of course, we also have to remember that many of the things that mainstream male teachers thought the women were doing, they weren't actually doing. It was a projection. Although we didn't have our witch trials the way Salem and others did, there was still stereotyping and chauvinism that was found. As always, it's important to recognize, see this, and recognize the error, because indeed, even people that have such brilliant insights as Sefer HaChinuch or Rambam in his own writings will still make mistakes, in particular when it comes to issues of the different genders. Okay, so, but he is trying to use this in the strongest hyperbole that he thinks will help us understand that God does not want us to cause pain to ourselves, because that is the opposite of the wisdom of the Torah. And Ramban, may his memory be blessed, wrote, this is Ramban on Deuteronomy 14, our verse. You can go back and read his commentary, which was not going to fit on the page here, so we got the short version, that from here, there is a support for our rabbis, may their memory be blessed, in their forbidding mourning for the dead more than is enough. And I can recommend, with a little bit of patience, if you take a look at Moed Katan, this section of the Talmud, that it talks about the fact that while Judaism does command us to mourn, that we have Shiva, we have Shloshim, we have a year for our parents, we do remember our dead in ways that will often cause us discomfort. The mourning practices are designed to move us out of our normal state and feel our grief. We also have a limit on how much we do that one should not stay in a perpetual state of mourning more than what Torah and tradition has told us to do. So we do not have people, for example, who will wear black for the rest of their lives. That is not considered to be a proper response within Judaism, that one should eventually move out of that state of intense grief and into a new form of life, difficult though it may be, that is not only characterized by grief. Again, much more to say about that in Moed Katan. happy to discuss that with anyone at another time if you read it and find it interesting, and we can go over those details. And Rambam, again, Ramban, Nachmanides, Rambam, Maimonides, may his memory be blessed, wrote this time in the Mishnah Torah that they, may their memory be blessed, also expounded that included in this warning, this negative commandment, is that there not be two courts in one city, whereby one follows one custom and the other follows another custom, as this causes disagreement. You may remember that little turn of phrase that we saw all the way back in the Ramah. Let's bring it back up just so you can see here, right? That based off the Talmud Yevamot 13b, that lo titkodedu is translated as lo ta'asu agudot agudot. Do not cut yourself, do not move yourself into all of these different groups. And he's explaining that Rambam goes into more detail to describe that this means not just you've got your practice, I've got my practice, but that we are actually now having separate courts which are settling disputes according to different opinions. Remember the Beit Din of a city in the ancient world and the modern world in which Sefer HaChinuch lived, well, pre-modern world that he lived in, the Beit Din was responsible for handling all sorts of discussions, not just how do we observe the counting of the Omer and what form of mourning do we do during that time period, but also who is liable under which kinds of personal injury cases and what sort of payments are going to be handled. That even though they may follow Judaism in general, the particular court will come to certain rulings that could be disagreed with by a different court. And as we have seen in different countries and different communities, that is perfectly normal and expected. That is why both the Ramah as well as Mishnah Brura and the Joseph Caro and the Shulchan Aruch itself all say, some do this practice, some do that practice. This is the one I recommend. This is what they do over there. Don't do that. They're all describing the fact that there are multiple ways of handling many of these issues. But within your community, you do need one, because the community needs to be bound together by its custom, not driven apart into ever more fractious groups that can't agree on the basic ideas. As he goes on to say from Rambam, disagreement. And the expression, do not dash yourself, lo titkodedu, is meaning to say, do not create many groupings, agudot, which means to say that they be differing from one another. But from my teacher, he now is adding another layer of interpretation, God protect him, I have learned that this prohibition is only with one group, some of which differs with the rest, and they are equal in wisdom. In such a case, it is forbidden for each of their factions to follow its own words, as this creates a disagreement among them. So he's trying to refine it, saying in his day, this wisdom had been received of not creating these separate groups, but with a little caveat that it's only when you actually have groups that are of equal standing, that some people are saying this, some people are saying that, and it seems, reasonable to go with either opinion. That's where we have the crisis. If one group is saying this is the way it should be, and they have good evidence and arguments, and the other is saying this is the way it should be because I just want to, then we're not talking about an agreement. And the second half of what he's about to say wouldn't apply, because when they are of equal standing and they have equal reasons for their positions, they should give and take. The shakla v'taria, the debate that happens between them, should give and take among themselves about the thing until they all agree to one opinion. It doesn't necessarily have to be the opinion that each of them started with. They can compromise and come to another resolution. That's the old joke of 2 Jews, 3 opinions. That's a good thing. It means that we have grown from this interaction. And what he is saying is that when we aren't in a position to simply say, this group is right and that group is wrong, but both groups make very good points, we don't just leave it as, do whatever you feel like. Instead, we should try to find reconciliation. Now, in the modern world, that is still difficult to achieve in many of our cases. And we have a bit more of the luxury of creating mini communities that are still larger than many of the complete communities in the ancient world. Orlando has many fine synagogues of different opinions, but each one of those is larger than many towns and villages were for most of our history. And that is generally considered acceptable, although finding moments where cooperation and collaboration can occur should always be our priority, that we not needlessly do things separately when we could be doing those same things together. But when we move away from the pockets of our Jewish community, we have to also recognize the truth that this is giving for a general community, meaning secular community, both locally, nationally, internationally, which is that we should always be looking for the give and take of discussion to try and find ways to compromise, because after all, we are together in this. And that means that we do need to find a path that will avoid unnecessarily gashing ourselves, of causing injury to ourselves. After all, we are not put here to create more suffering for ourselves than the grief that we are meant to observe when necessary. And even that there is a limit to. Instead, we are here to be able to appreciate this world, to let our souls grow through its choices and goodness and the experiences that we have. And that is best done when we are not struggling with each other, when we could be doing it much better. So with that, I will ask if there are any questions. I'm not seeing anybody on YouTube. I don't think anyone is undoing themselves on Zoom. No problem. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. In which case, I will wish you all a wonderful day, and I will see you as we come back again next week to study our next